I grew up in a small house with a front porch my mother kept sweeping. Even when there wasn't a single leaf in sight, she would hum old songs under her breath as the broom bristles scraped against the wood. I didn't know the names of those songs, but I could tell they were older than she was. My father worked at the same factory since before I was born. He would leave before the sun came up and return just as it was going down. His hands were always rough, his nails permanently stained with the smell of oil and metal. We weren't poor, but we lived within limits, and I hated those limits more than I understood them. As a child, I thought money was the only thing keeping us from happiness. I looked at the big houses on the other side of town, and wondered why my parents couldn't give me that. When I was 10, I asked my mother why we didn't have a new car like the Petersons next door. She didn't answer right away, just kept peeling potatoes over the sink. Finally, she said, "Because we have other things, son. Things money can't buy, and one day you'll see." I didn't see it then. When I was 12, I started noticing how my friends had cable TV brand name sneakers and vacations to the beach. We had one small TV that picked up only a handful of channels, and every summer our big trip was to visit my aunt in another town. I started to resent it. I started to resent them. When I was 13, I told my mother I wish Dad made more money. She stopped folding the laundry mid-shirt and looked at me like she was searching for the boy. She thought she knew. "Your father works harder than anyone I know," she said, "and one day you'll see that's worth more than a paycheck." I shrugged and walked away. My teenage years were full of arguments over small things: why I couldn't have the latest phone, why my curfew was earlier than my friends, why they insisted on family dinners every night, even when I wanted to be with my friends. At the time it felt suffocating. Now I know it was love in its purest form. But back then all I saw were rules, and more rules. High school became my ticket out. I joined every club, applied for every scholarship, and told myself I would never live like this again. I thought success meant escaping the life they built. When I graduated, my father shook my hand instead of hugging me. I mistook his formality for coldness, when it was really pride mixed with not knowing how to show it. I remember my mother crying in the kitchen that night while doing dishes. I didn't ask why. I assumed it was because she was sad to see me go. I didn't think about how she might have felt losing the daily presence of the boy she raised. I went to college 2 states away and called home once a week. If I remembered, most calls were short because I was either too busy or too distracted. My mother would ask if I was eating well, and I'd answer with a quick "yeah, I'm fine," just to end the conversation. My father rarely came on the line, and when he did, it was to ask how my grades were or if my car was running okay. I never told them about the nights I felt lonely or the mornings I didn't want to get out of bed. I kept those parts of my life separate from them, as if they couldn't understand. When I came home for holidays, I felt like a guest. The house smelled the same, the porch looked the same, but I didn't. I wore suits now and carried myself like someone who believed he was on his way to something bigger. I spent most of my time with old friends and barely sat down with my parents. I told myself they didn't mind, but I never asked. After college, I moved to the city. The distance grew in miles, and in heart I visited maybe twice a year, usually at Christmas, and even then I was checking my phone during dinner. I told myself they had each other and didn't need me, but the truth was I didn't know how to be close to them anymore. My career took over everything. Promotions became my proof of worth, and travel became my excuse for absence. Every time my mother left a voicemail, I thought, I'll call her back later, but later could mean weeks. When my father retired, they had a small celebration at the factory. I didn't go because I had a major client meeting. He left me a message saying he understood, but there was a pause in his voice that said otherwise. 2 years later, my mother had surgery. I didn't visit until she was home and recovering. She said she was fine, but her eyes told me she had wished I'd been there when she woke up in the hospital. I told myself I'd make more time soon, but soon never came. When you lived like I did then came the call from my sister one morning telling me Dad had a heart scare and was in the hospital. I was across the country and booked the next flight. By the time I walked into the hospital room, he was sitting up joking with nurses. I acted relieved, but inside I was shaken. I had almost lost my father without being there. That night, sleeping in my old room, I noticed every photo on the walls: birthdays, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, all the moments I had forgotten or ignored. I realized I didn't know what their daily lives looked like anymore. I didn't know what made them laugh lately, or what kept them up at night. I had been so busy chasing my own life that I had missed theirs. Lying in that bed, surrounded by memories, I couldn't shake the thought that time was running out. I told myself I wouldn't waste what was left, but promises in the dark are easy to make and hard to keep. The morning after I got back from the hospital, I found my father sitting on the porch drinking coffee. He was wearing the same flannel shirt he'd had since I was in high school. I sat down next to him, and for a moment we just listened to the sound of birds. Finally, I said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." He didn't look at me right away, just sipped his coffee and said, "You're here now, that's what matters." But I knew it wasn't the whole truth. Later that day, I offered to drive my parents into town to run errands. My mother smiled like I'd just given her a gift. We went to the grocery store, the post office, and a small diner for lunch. It was the kind of ordinary day they probably had 100 times without me. I realized how many of those days I'd missed and how much they meant to them. At lunch, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said Everything that night I called my office and told them I'd be taking a few weeks off. They were shocked because I never took time off, but for the first time in my career, I didn't care what they thought. The next morning I helped my father in the garage. We fixed a loose door hinge and sorted his old tools. He told me stories about where each tool came from like they were family heirlooms. I realized I'd never asked him about these things before. One afternoon we sat on the porch and my father told me about his own dad, how he was strict and quiet, but always made sure the family had what they needed. I saw the pattern. Then my father loved the way his father had loved. Through action, not words. It was a language I had never bothered to learn until now. I started joining my mother in the kitchen while she cooked. At first I just kept her company, but soon I was chopping vegetables and stirring pots. She taught me her recipes and I wrote them down because I didn't want them to disappear with time. Cooking together became our thing. Some evenings I'd invite my sister and her kids over for dinner. My parents' house started feeling alive again in a way it hadn't for years. We laughed around the table telling stories I'd heard before, but wanted to hear again. I noticed how my father's laugh came from deep in his chest and how my mother covered her mouth when she smiled. Little details I had overlooked my whole life now felt priceless. One weekend I suggested we take a drive to the lake where we used to go. When I was a kid they agreed instantly. Walking along the shore brought back flashes of fishing with Dad and chasing dragonflies with Mom. We sat on a bench watching the water, and I thought about how many years had passed since the last time we'd done this together. On the way home my father said, "I'm glad you remember this place." I told him I never really forgot. I just didn't make time to come back. That night, lying in my old bed, I felt a mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for the time we still had, shame for the time I'd wasted. I started taking photos of everything. My parents in the kitchen, my father in the garden, my mother reading on the porch. I wanted proof of these moments in case my memory failed me someday. One evening after dinner my father handed me an old wooden box. Inside were letters I had sent home from college. Some were short and rushed, others full of stories about classes and friends. He told me your mother kept everyone. I flipped through them and realized how much they had treasured even my smallest efforts to stay connected. It broke my heart to think about all the years when I didn't bother writing at all. I decided to make up for it. Every time I left to visit the city I wrote them a letter within a week. Sometimes I mailed postcards from places I traveled just so they'd have something to pin on the fridge. I began noticing changes in myself too. I was more patient, slower to judge, quicker to listen. My priorities shifted from climbing ladders to building bridges. Friends in the city noticed and asked what happened. I told them I went home and remembered what mattered. Not everyone understood, but the ones who did started calling their own parents more often. It felt good to know my changes might ripple out to others. One night my mother asked if I remembered the day I told her I wished Dad made more money. I felt my face heat up and said yes, and I'm sorry. She smiled and said, "I knew you didn't understand back then, but I hoped you would someday." I told her I understood now. The next morning my father asked if I wanted to go with him to the farmer's market. We walked through stalls of fresh produce, shaking hands with people he'd known for decades. It was like seeing another side of him I'd never paid attention to. He wasn't just my dad, he was part of a community, part of a world I had ignored. As the weeks passed I realized I didn't want to go back to my old life completely. I started splitting my time between the city and home. I still worked, but I worked less. I made sure to be there for birthdays, for holidays, for no reason at all, and slowly the years of distance began to fade. The summer after my father's health scare was the first summer in decades that I didn't spend chasing deadlines. Instead, I spent it chasing moments. I woke up early not to check emails, but to sit with my parents on the porch. While the world was still quiet, my mother would bring out coffee for the three of us, and we'd watch the sunlight creep across the lawn. Some mornings we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence felt full instead of empty. I started helping my father with the garden. He showed me how to tell when the tomatoes were ready and how to pinch the basil so it would keep growing. I realized he'd been trying to teach me things my whole life. I had just been too busy to notice. One Saturday we drove out to the lake again. This time I brought my camera and took photos of them holding hands as they walked along the shore. My father laughed and told me to stop making them feel like celebrities, but I kept taking pictures because I knew these days were precious. We stopped for ice cream on the way home just like we used to when I was a kid. My mother got the same flavor she always did, and my father got the one he pretended to hate, but always finished. I started inviting my city friends to visit. Some of them hadn't seen a small town in years. They were surprised by how welcome my parents made them feel. We had long dinners on the porch telling stories until the fireflies came out. One friend pulled me aside and said, "I get why you come back here now." I realized I was slowly building a bridge between the two worlds I'd lived in for so long. In August, my sister suggested we throw a big family barbecue. We invited cousins, neighbors, and even a few old friends of my parents I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The yard was full of laughter and the smell of grilled corn. My father stood by the grill flipping burgers while my mother moved from table to table making sure everyone had enough to eat. I watched them and thought about how much of my life I'd spent missing out on scenes like this. That night after everyone left, I told them how proud I was to be their son. My father just nodded, but I could see the shine in his eyes. My mother squeezed my hand and said, "We're proud of you too, not for your job or your money, but for this, for being here." Those words stayed with me. I began to notice little things about them that I'd never paid attention to before, the way my father's hands shook slightly when he was tired, the way my mother paused before standing up because her knees hurt. It reminded me that time was moving, whether I was ready or not, so I started planning small trips we could take together. We went to the state fair, where my father tried to win my mother a stuffed bear. At the ring toss, we visited a botanical garden where my mother stopped to smell every single flower. We drove to the mountains and had lunch at a diner that had been there since before I was born. Each trip felt like adding another bead to a necklace I wished I'd started stringing years ago. In the fall, I convinced them to come stay with me in the city for a week. At first, they were hesitant, saying they didn't want to be in the way, but I promised I wanted them there. I showed them my favorite park, my favorite coffee shop, and even took them to the farmer's market in my neighborhood. They met my friends, and my friends told me later how much they loved my parents. One night, while they were in the guest room, I overheard them talking quietly. My father said, "I think he's finally home." My mother said, "He never really left, he just had to find his way back." I stood there in the hallway holding back tears. That week in the city felt like a full circle moment. It wasn't just me visiting their world anymore, they were part of mine. When winter came, I worried about my father's health again, so I made it a habit to call them every night before bed. Sometimes the calls were short, just to say goodnight. Other times we'd talk for an hour about nothing and everything. It became my favorite part of the day. On Christmas Eve, we all gathered at my parents' house again. The snow was falling outside and the house was warm with the smell of cinnamon and roast chicken. After dinner, we sat by the fireplace exchanging small gifts. My parents gave me a framed photo from that summer at the lake. Underneath, they had written, "Thank you for coming home." I couldn't speak for a moment. When I finally did, I told them thank you for waiting for me. That night, I lay in my old bed, listening to the house settle around me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: peace. In the spring, my mother wanted to start a family recipe book. We spent afternoons cooking together. While I wrote down every ingredient and instruction, she told me the stories behind each dish, who taught her how to make it when she first cooked it for my father, how it had changed over the years. It felt like I was collecting pieces of her to keep forever. My father started showing me his woodworking projects. He taught me how to sand the edges smooth and how to stain the wood so the grain shone through. I built a small table with him, and we carved our initials on the underside. He said, "Now you can't forget who taught you." We kept finding small ways to be together. Fishing on cool mornings, playing cards on rainy afternoons, watching old movies in the evenings with popcorn. I realized that the best days weren't the big trips or the special events, they were the simple ones where we were just together. By the time summer rolled around again, I felt like we had reclaimed something I thought was lost forever. We had built not just memories, but a rhythm, a way of being in each other's lives that felt natural and strong. One evening, I sat on the porch with them, watching the sun dip behind the trees. I told them I wished I had been around more in my 20s and 30s. My father said, "The past is a place to learn from, not to live in." My mother said, "What matters is you're here now." And in that moment, I believed them. I didn't know how many more summers we'd have, but I knew I wouldn't waste them. I finally understood what they had been trying to teach me all along, that love isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up again and again, even in the smallest ways. And for the first time in my life, I was showing up.